Looking back, I should have seen the signs earlier. Donna had started acting distant months before, her usual warmth replaced with indifference that I couldn't explain. She'd pick fights over the smallest things, brush off my attempts to connect, and spend more time out with friends than at home. At first, I blamed it on stress. Her work had always been demanding, and I convinced myself it was just a rough patch. Marriage wasn't supposed to be easy, right? But the truth has a way of surfacing. One evening, when she said she was working late, something in her voice didn't sit right. I don't know if it was the way she avoided my eyes or how she grabbed her phone the second it buzzed, but my gut told me something was wrong. Against my better judgment, I let it go that night, trying to trust her. Then came the phone bill. A number I didn't recognize popped up repeatedly, at all hours of the day and night. My curiosity turned to unease, and unease turned into dread. I'd never been the kind of man to pry, but I needed answers. The next day, I called the number, and Simon answered. The pieces fell into place, hitting me all at once. Simon wasn't just anyone. He was someone I had invited into my home, someone I thought I could trust. The thought of them together made my stomach churn. When I confronted Donna, she denied everything. She laughed it off at first, then twisted the narrative, blaming me for being paranoid and controlling. It wasn't until I laid out the evidence, messages I'd pieced together, a hotel receipt tucked into her purse, that her lies began to crack. Still, she refused to own up to it. She tried to flip the script, claiming I had driven her to this, that I'd been too absorbed in my work, too distant, too cold. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way she looked at me, as if I were the one who had broken our vows. As if I hadn't been the one trying to hold us together while she tore everything apart. I filed for divorce the next morning. There was nothing left to save. The life I thought I had, the future I'd built in my mind, was gone. That should have been the end of it, but it was only the beginning. Donna wasn't finished with me yet. The days after filing for divorce were a blur of anger and exhaustion. Donna wasn't content with just walking away. She made it her mission to paint herself as the victim, twisting the story for anyone who'd listen. Friends who once shared meals at our table now looked at me with suspicion, whispering behind my back. She spread lies, claims that I'd neglected her, that I was unfaithful, that I'd pushed her into Simon's arms. It felt like losing everything at once. My marriage was over, and now the relationships I thought were solid were crumbling too. Some people believed me, but many didn't. I was a lawyer after all, someone who, in their eyes, could spin any narrative to suit my agenda. Donna knew how to weaponize that, leaning into the image of a wounded woman crushed by an unfeeling husband. Despite the chaos, I stayed focused. My work became my anchor, the only thing I had control over. I threw myself into my cases, hoping the endless hours would drown out the noise. But even at work, I wasn't safe. Donna sent emails to my colleagues, vague insinuations that I'd been emotionally abusive, making me out to be the villain in our unraveling marriage. The weight of it all felt unbearable. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I avoided places we used to go together because I couldn't face the memories, or the questions from acquaintances who'd inevitably heard her side of the story. Amidst all of this, I crossed paths with Irene. It wasn't planned or orchestrated. Life simply threw us together in the most unexpected way. Simon had left her too, abandoning her while she was pregnant. She was as lost as I was, navigating the wreckage of her life while trying to prepare for a baby she'd now be raising on her own. We met by chance at a coffee shop. Irene looked exhausted, clutching her belly as if holding herself together physically might stop everything else from falling apart. At first, I hesitated to approach her, unsure of what I could even say. But when our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between us. Two people caught in the same storm, struggling to stay afloat. Talking to her felt strangely comforting. She told me about Simon's deceit, the lies he'd spun to keep her in the dark, how he'd disappeared when she needed him most. Her story mirrored mine in so many ways. There was no judgment between us, just a shared pain that neither of us needed to explain. As we continued talking, I found myself opening up about Donna in a way I hadn't with anyone else. Irene didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix things. She just listened, nodding with a quiet empathy that felt like a balm on an open wound. From that day forward, we began to lean on each other. We weren't friends, not yet. It was more like an alliance, a mutual understanding that we were stronger together than apart. Little did I know how much Irene would come to mean to me. But for now, all we had was the shared weight of betrayal, and somehow, that was enough to keep us both moving forward. The more time I spent with Irene, the more I realized how deeply Simon's betrayal had scarred her. She wasn't just grieving the loss of a partner. She was grappling with the future he'd stolen from her. Simon had promised her a family, a life together, and then abandoned her the moment responsibility knocked at his door. She carried all of that while preparing to welcome a child into the world, a child Simon had already decided wasn't worth his time. We started meeting more often, first at the coffee shop and then at her apartment. I would bring her small things she needed: groceries, baby supplies, even a few books I thought she'd enjoy. She tried to act like she had everything under control, but I could see through it. Her apartment, once neatly kept, was now cluttered with unopened boxes of baby furniture and stacks of unpaid bills. She was overwhelmed, and who wouldn't be? In helping Irene, I found a strange sense of purpose. My own life was in shambles, but at least I could be useful to someone else. I began to look forward to our conversations. We'd sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Irene told me about her hopes for her daughter, the kind of mother she wanted to be, and the fears that kept her awake at night. I listened, offering what little comfort I could, but mostly, I just tried to be there. One afternoon, Irene confided in me about the extent of Simon's lies. He had painted a picture of himself as the perfect man, stable, loyal, ready to settle down. But as their relationship progressed, cracks started to show. He was evasive about his past, inconsistent with his stories, and increasingly absent. When she found out about Donna, it wasn't through him. A mutual friend had tipped her off, and by the time Irene confronted him, he was already halfway out the door. Hearing her recount Simon's betrayal stirred something in me. I recognized the pattern of deceit, the way he'd manipulated her into doubting her instincts. It was the same game Donna had played, twisting the truth until I didn't know which way was up. But Irene wasn't bitter. If anything, she seemed determined not to let Simon's actions define her. She told me she wasn't angry for herself anymore. She was angry for her daughter, who would grow up without a father because of his selfishness. That anger fueled her resolve to move forward, even when everything felt impossible. Watching Irene's strength inspired me. It didn't erase the pain of what Donna had done, but it reminded me that life could go on. That even in the aftermath of betrayal, there was a way forward. Our connection deepened over time, though neither of us acknowledged it outright. There was a comfort in being around someone who understood what it felt like to be broken but still have to keep going. I found myself caring about Irene in a way I hadn't expected. Not just as someone who shared my pain, but as someone whose strength and kindness gave me hope. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt crushing. Irene would sometimes break down, overwhelmed by the reality of raising a child alone. I would feel the anger creeping back, not just at Donna and Simon, but at myself for trusting them in the first place. We were two people trying to patch up the holes in our lives, leaning on each other to stay upright. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in weeks, I started to feel like I wasn't completely alone. When Irene finally decided to take legal action against Simon, I offered to help. As a lawyer, I knew the system could be cold and unforgiving, especially for someone in her position. A pregnant woman trying to secure the future of her child while battling the man who had already abandoned them. Simon, unsurprisingly, was resistant. He denied paternity at first, claiming Irene was trying to trap him for his money. It was a cruel accusation, one that made my blood boil. He filed motion after motion, stalling the process, hoping she would give up. I'd seen this kind of behavior before, men using the legal system as a weapon to exhaust and intimidate their opponents. But Irene wasn't about to back down. Working on her case became a personal mission for me. I poured every ounce of my energy into making sure Simon couldn't wriggle out of his responsibilities. We gathered evidence, texts, receipts, even photos, and painted a picture of a man who had knowingly abandoned his pregnant partner. As we prepared for the hearing, Irene's determination impressed me. She was nervous, of course, but she didn't let it show. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, but she pressed on for the sake of her daughter. Watching her fight so fiercely for Eve was a reminder of what real strength looked like. Donna, predictably, found a way to involve herself. Somehow, she and Simon had become a united front, working together to undermine both Irene and me. Donna claimed that I was manipulating Irene for revenge, painting us as two bitter exes trying to ruin their lives. The lies she spread were vicious and deeply personal, aimed at discrediting Irene's character and my integrity as a lawyer. It was infuriating to see the woman I'd once loved stoop so low. But Donna's involvement only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about proving that their actions wouldn't go unchecked. The day of the hearing was tense. Irene and I sat together, waiting for our turn, while Simon and Donna whispered to each other on the other side of the room. Seeing them together felt like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the lives they had wrecked without a second thought. When it was Irene's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke about the promises Simon had made, the life they were supposed to build together, and the ways he had failed not just her, but their unborn daughter. Her words were raw and honest, cutting through Simon's web of lies like a blade. As her lawyer, I presented the evidence, dismantling Simon's claims piece by piece. I could see the cracks forming in his facade as he tried to maintain his composure. Donna, for all her smugness, looked visibly uncomfortable when the truth about Simon's behavior was laid bare. In the end, the court ruled in Irene's favor. Simon was ordered to pay child support once Eve was born and to cover Irene's legal fees. It wasn't a complete victory. No amount of money could undo what Simon had done, but it was a step forward. After the hearing, Irene broke down in tears. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of relief. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. As we left the courthouse, I realized how much had changed. Irene wasn't just a stranger I'd met by chance. She had become someone I deeply cared about. We were still picking up the pieces of our lives, but we were doing it together. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the future didn't seem so bleak. Winning the court case against Simon gave Irene a small sense of justice, but it was far from over. As Eve's due date approached, Simon began to backpedal, claiming he wanted to be a father after all. Irene didn't buy it for a second, and neither did I. This wasn't about responsibility. It was about control. He wanted to stay in her life, not as a parent, but as someone who could still pull the strings when it suited him. Simon's sudden interest in custody felt like a calculated move. He filed a motion for joint custody, claiming that he deserved a chance to connect with his child, even though he had done nothing but make Irene's life miserable. The hypocrisy was staggering. The man who had abandoned her during her pregnancy now wanted to swoop in and play the role of a doting father. The court battle that followed was even more brutal than the first. Simon hired an aggressive lawyer, someone who didn't care about the truth, only about winning. They dug into Irene's personal life, questioning her ability to be a mother, using her single status and financial struggles as weapons against her. Watching her endure that kind of scrutiny was infuriating. Donna, of course, was there too. She acted as Simon's character witness, claiming that he had always wanted to be a father but had been pushed away by Irene's emotional instability. Hearing Donna speak about Irene like that made my stomach turn. This was the woman who had destroyed my life, now trying to do the same to Irene, and she didn't even flinch. Despite their efforts, Irene stood firm. She talked about the sacrifices she'd already made for Eve, the plans she had for her daughter's future, and her unwavering commitment to giving her a stable, loving home. She didn't have Simon's wealth or his charm, but what she had was authenticity. The turning point came when we presented evidence of Simon's neglect. Texts where he ignored Irene's concerns about her pregnancy. Financial records showing he'd refused to contribute to prenatal care. Even a timeline that exposed how quickly he'd abandoned her after finding out about the baby. Every piece painted a picture of a man who only cared about himself. When the judge ruled in Irene's favor, granting her full custody and limited supervised visitation rights for Simon, it felt like a weight had been lifted. Irene hugged me tightly outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face. She kept saying over and over how relieved she was, how she finally felt like she could protect her daughter from the chaos Simon brought into her life. But Simon and Donna weren't done. A few days later, Simon tried to contact Irene directly, bypassing the court order. He showed up at her apartment unannounced, pounding on the door and demanding to see her. I was there that night, helping her unpack baby supplies, and the sound of his voice sent a chill down my spine. I stepped outside to confront him. He looked at me with the same smug arrogance he'd always carried, as if he thought he could intimidate me into stepping aside. But I wasn't the same man I'd been months ago. I told him calmly but firmly that he was violating the court order and that if he didn't leave, I'd call the police. Simon tried to argue, but the sight of me standing my ground seemed to rattle him. Eventually he left, but not without throwing a parting shot about how Irene was playing the victim. That night, Irene thanked me for being there. She said she didn't know how she would have handled it alone, and for the first time, I realized just how much she trusted me. It wasn't just about legal battles or shared pain anymore. Our connection had grown into something deeper, something neither of us was ready to name. Eve was born 2 weeks later, and holding her in my arms for the first time felt like a fresh start for both of us. Irene's strength had carried her through the storm, and now, standing beside her, I felt like I was finally starting to find my own. Eve's arrival changed everything. The moment Irene placed her in my arms, I felt a strange mix of emotions: joy, hope, and an unfamiliar sense of belonging. It wasn't just about Irene anymore. It was about this tiny, fragile life that had somehow become part of the complicated web we'd been navigating. Irene seemed lighter after Eve was born, as though the weight of Simon's betrayal had finally lifted. She poured herself into being a mother, and it was awe-inspiring to watch. The quiet moments, her gently rocking Eve to sleep, humming a soft melody, or the way she smiled down at her daughter as if nothing else mattered, stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. Still, the shadows of the past lingered. Simon's attempts to interfere didn't stop. He used his supervised visits as an opportunity to play the victim, complaining about how he was being kept away from his daughter. Donna occasionally tagged along, her presence a reminder of the life I was trying to leave behind. But Irene handled it with grace, refusing to let them disrupt the peace she was building for herself and Eve. I tried to focus on helping Irene where I could, fixing things around her apartment, babysitting when she needed a break, and offering support as she adjusted to life as a single mother. In doing so, I found myself healing too. The anger I'd carried for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. One evening, while Irene was putting Eve to bed, I sat alone in her living room, reflecting on how far we'd come. The chaos of the past few months felt like a distant memory, though the scars it left behind were still visible. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the one I'd lost with Donna, but the one I might still have. Irene returned, sitting down beside me with a tired but contented smile. The silence between us was comfortable, no longer weighted by grief or uncertainty. In that moment, I realized how much I valued her presence in my life. She wasn't just someone who understood my pain, she was someone who made it easier to bear. Our bond deepened in ways neither of us acknowledged outright. There were small gestures, a lingering glance, the way her hand would brush against mine when we passed Eve back and forth, or the ease with which we fell into a rhythm around each other. It was unspoken but undeniable. I started noticing the little things about her, how her laugh softened when she was with Eve, the way she always seemed to know what I needed to hear when I was overwhelmed. It wasn't romantic at first, at least, not in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, something that felt like trust and comfort. But with that growing connection came fear. Neither of us wanted to admit what was happening. We were still navigating the wreckage of our past lives, and the idea of complicating things further seemed reckless. So we left it unsaid, focusing instead on building a sense of normalcy for Eve. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. Irene and I had taken Eve to the park, her tiny face lighting up at the sight of the trees swaying in the breeze. As I watched Irene hold her daughter, her eyes filled with so much love and determination, I felt something click. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude, it was the realization that I wanted to be a part of their lives in a way I hadn't dared to consider before. I didn't say anything that day, but I knew things were changing. Irene and I had spent so much time helping each other heal that we hadn't noticed we were building something new in the process. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The past still cast its shadow, but for the first time, the light felt stronger. The shift between Irene and me was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. We didn't talk about it or try to define what was happening, but the dynamic between us began to change. It was in the small things, the way her smile lingered when I walked through the door, the way I caught myself looking forward to our evenings together after Eve had gone to sleep. For so long, we had been two broken people leaning on each other for support, but somewhere along the way, that bond had grown into something more. I wasn't just helping Irene rebuild her life anymore. I was becoming a part of it. But the past wasn't ready to let us go. Simon and Donna weren't finished with their games. Just as Irene and I were finding a rhythm, Donna reached out to me for the first time in weeks. She claimed she wanted to talk, her tone laced with the manipulative charm I'd fallen for years ago. I ignored her, but it left me uneasy. Donna didn't do anything without an ulterior motive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was on the horizon. A few days later, the trouble arrived. Simon filed an appeal for more visitation rights, accusing Irene of alienating him from Eve. His lawyer argued that Simon's limited visits were hindering his ability to bond with his daughter. It was a calculated move, designed to drag Irene back into court and force her to fight yet another battle. Irene was shaken but resolute. She refused to let Simon disrupt the stability she'd worked so hard to create. Together, we prepared for the next round of legal battles, determined not to let him win. In the midst of all this, Donna's involvement became more apparent. She was feeding Simon information about Irene, using every detail she could twist into a weapon. At one point, she even accused Irene of being reckless and unstable, claiming that I was enabling her out of revenge against Donna and Simon. It was an exhausting, infuriating mess, and I hated that Irene had to endure it. Despite the chaos, our bond only grew stronger. Irene leaned on me in ways she hadn't before, and I found myself caring for her and Eve as if they were my own. I started spending more nights at her apartment, falling into a routine that felt strangely natural. We weren't a couple, not officially, but everything about our lives pointed to the fact that we were becoming something more. Then came the night that changed everything. Irene and I were sitting on her couch, exhausted after another long day of preparing for court. Eve had just fallen asleep, and the apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the baby monitor. Irene leaned her head against my shoulder, a gesture so simple yet so intimate that it caught me off guard. In that moment, it all came rushing to the surface. The months of shared pain, the nights spent talking until dawn, the quiet moments of understanding that had built a foundation stronger than anything I'd ever known. I realized that I didn't just care about Irene and Eve. I loved them. Irene must have sensed the shift, because she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something unspoken. Neither of us said a word, but the silence between us was filled with everything we didn't need to say. That night, as I left her apartment, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Hope for the future we might build together, and fear of what it would mean to take that step. We were both carrying so much baggage, and the thought of complicating our lives even further was daunting. But for the first time, the fear didn't outweigh the possibility. Our lives were still messy, still tangled in the aftermath of betrayal and heartbreak. But standing at the edge of something new, I couldn't help but feel that we were finally moving toward a place where the past couldn't touch us anymore. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand confession or dramatic moment that cemented our relationship. Instead, it was a gradual, quiet unfolding, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. Irene and I didn't need words to acknowledge what we both knew. We had become a family, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that felt just as real, just as meaningful. The legal battles with Simon continued to rear their ugly head, but Irene faced them with a strength that left me in awe. Every time Simon tried to undermine her, she pushed back harder. Every time Donna added fuel to the fire, Irene refused to let it consume her. And through it all, I stayed by her side, not just as her lawyer, but as someone who cared deeply about her and Eve. Eventually, the court denied Simon's appeal. He was granted only minimal visitation under strict supervision, with the judge citing his history of neglect and manipulation. It wasn't a complete victory. Nothing could undo the damage he'd caused, but it was enough to give Irene the peace of mind she needed to move forward. With the legal battles behind us, Irene and I began to focus on building a life together. It wasn't something we planned or even discussed in detail. It just happened naturally, in the quiet moments that made up our days. I started spending more time at her apartment, helping with Eve's bedtime routine, fixing small things around the house, and sharing meals that often ended with both of us laughing at the absurdity of our journey. Eve was the glue that held us together. Watching her grow, seeing her tiny hands clutch mine, and hearing her laugh for the first time brought a kind of joy I hadn't thought possible after everything that had happened. She became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always something worth fighting for. Donna and Simon's presence in our lives gradually faded. Donna tried to reach out a few more times, but I ignored her attempts. Whatever guilt or regrets she carried were hers to bear. I had no interest in reopening old wounds. As for Simon, his visits with Eve were few and far between, and it became clear that his initial push for custody had been more about pride than genuine interest in fatherhood. The day Irene and I officially became a couple felt almost anticlimactic. There was no grand announcement or romantic gesture. It was just a quiet acknowledgement of what had already been true for a while. One evening, as we sat on her couch watching Eve sleep in her bassinet, Irene rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I didn't respond with words, but the way I held her hand said everything. The months that followed were some of the happiest of my life. It wasn't perfect. There were challenges, moments of doubt, and the lingering shadows of our pasts, but it was real. Irene and I built something together that felt strong, something that could withstand the storms life had thrown at us. As I look back now, it's hard to believe how far we've come. The betrayal that once felt like the end of everything turned out to be the beginning of something new. Irene and I had found each other in the wreckage, and together, we'd built a life that was messy and imperfect but filled with love. Eve's laughter now fills the spaces that were once hollow. Irene's presence has turned what felt like a house of ruins into a home. And as for me, I've learned that even when the worst happens, even when it feels like the world has been pulled out from under you, there's always a chance to start again. It's not the life I planned, but it's a life I wouldn't trade for anything.